In stressful, uncertain times, when cynical powers attempt to divide and isolate us, community and solidarity are acts of resistance. But there are no superheroes here and no simple answers to be found, only the quest for connection. In 2025, we're responding to the need for community and solidarity in uncertain times by turning Conference to Restore Humanity into a model for humanizing critical discourse and dialogue, bringing together students and teachers, researchers and doers, thinkers and visionaries to explore complex topics in education and illuminate a path forward together. What if, instead of viewing the fringes as an educational afterthought, we treated them as a blueprint for what schools could become? In our opening flipped keynote, Dr. Sarah Fine will explore what can be learned from spaces that are often seen as peripheral to the core purposes of school: elective courses, career and technical education pathways, alternative education programs, and extracurricular activities. These spaces carry powerful lessons about how to design for authentic relationships and deeper learning. And we are taking our flipped keynote model one step further by adding fireside chats, moderated panel discussions followed by audience Q&A. Shanae Bond, Maria Monroe-Schuster, Luckett Keish, and Will Richardson will lead us in dialogue about the challenges facing education today and how we can collectively address them in 2025 and beyond. Audrey Waters, Shayna V. White, V. Dow, and Charles Logan will help us answer what, if anything, should be the relationship of AI and EdTech to education. We'll also be hosting a student panel of young people from Great Plains Action Society, an Indigenous-led grassroots organization advocating for Indigenous rights, to speak to their experiences and perspectives as Indigenous youth today. And instead of week-long learning tracks as we've had in the past, we are including 2-hour daily workshops with expert practitioners. Nawal Karuni will help participants understand and connect family practices to curriculum to create deeper, more authentic caregiver collaborations. Dr. Emma McMain reimagines SEL as open dialogue, not a checklist, connecting social and emotional learning to culture and society. Angela Stockman invites participants to explore how pedagogical documentation can serve as an act of stewardship, honoring, preserving, and nurturing rich narratives about learners and learning. And we'll continue to use our Discord as a hub for camaraderie, community, and to keep the conversation going beyond the live events. Our virtual Conference to Restore Humanity 2025 runs July 21st through the 23rd. To make this year as accessible and sustainable as ever, we've cut the ticket price to just $50. You can learn more about Conference to Restore Humanity and register on our website at humanrestorationproject.org/conference. Thank you so much for joining us on our quest for connection as we continue the journey to restore humanity to education together. Hello and welcome to episode 173 of the Human Restoration Project podcast. My name is Nick Covington. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that this episode is brought to you by our supporters, 3 of whom are Julia Valenti, Janet Clark, and Timothy Fox. Thank you all so much for your ongoing support. The problems we face are not the fault of any single individual or organization. They are often the byproduct of good intentions. And yet, alongside children and young people and their parents and careers, it's educators who are most exposed to these pressures, who confront them every day and try to make it all work regardless, writes today's guest in a piece from May titled Confronting the Educational Polycrisis. Joining us from Brighton, UK, Dr. James Mannion is a keynote speaker, teacher trainer, researcher, consultant, and author with a passion for educational and political reform. He's the co-founder and director of Rethinking Education, a teacher training organization specializing in implementation and improvement science, self-regulated learning, and practitioner inquiry. A former teacher of 12 years, James has a master's in person-centered education from the University of Sussex and a PhD in self-regulated learning from the University of Cambridge. He's also the host of the popular Rethinking Education podcast, of which I've been a huge fan for a long time. In fact, HRP contributed our very first video essay to a virtual arm of James's Rethinking Education conference way back in 2022. So this conversation crossover has certainly been a long time coming. We have multiple crises on our hands, James writes. They interact and have become entangled. This makes them difficult to resolve, but resolve them we must. And my hope today is that even if we can't untangle the polycrisis, we can at least get a better grasp and perhaps loosen their hold on our education systems. Thanks so much for joining me today, James.
You're very welcome. This is, like as you say, it's been a long time coming, and it's a long time bucket list item to come on the Human Restoration Project podcast. And my good buddy Kate McAllister is seething with envy that I've managed to beat her to this, because I know that she shares that bucket list desire as well.
Well, James, before we dive into the poly crisis and everything that deals with that's untangling, I've got to know more about your training and your academic work in person-centered education and a PhD in self-regulated learning, which honestly sounds like it's a little bit of an oxymoron. But what experience led you to decide that as a course of study that you wanted to dedicate yourself to?
Yeah, that's a good question. It actually has really long roots. This question, and a long time sort of precedes my entry into the profession as a teacher. Where I think just for like through most of my 20s, I just whenever I sort of like I had quite a gentle start to my career. Let's say I was really into art and doing like music and poetry and stuff. And so when I left uni, I just wanted to work in jobs like manual labor jobs, basically something that didn't occupy my brain space, which I wanted to keep for myself. So I did lots of like building work and laboring and greenkeeping and on golf courses and gardening and what have you. And I just went from pillar to post really, and just sort of spent a lot of time thinking about stuff, mulling things over. And whenever I thought about the problems of the world, I would just invariably, like just following the thread, I would just find myself back at education's doorstep. I like just and not necessarily saying like the education system is directly to blame for all the ills of the world, but rather that if we had a different system, we would see a very different world. And that really crystallized for me when I worked just as a typist for like a few months. I was temping as a typist for the probation service. I don't know if you have like something that's quite the same. Do you use that word probation in the States?
I'm not sure if it's a different context. What is the context of probation in the UK?
Okay, so the probation service is essentially like it's a public service that's around the legal system, and so probation officers work with people often to try to understand them, to try to sort of help to keep them out of prison, to understand why they're offending and so on. And so when somebody has committed a crime and they've been convicted by a judge, but they're awaiting sentencing, they would have an interview with a probation officer who would find out their backstory, right? And then they would write a pre-sentence report that they would then send to the judge to inform sentencing. So I don't. Do you have something equivalent to that in the States?
I'm sure we do. I
Right.
haven't worked in similar positions, so it's
Right.
hard
Yeah.
for me to be
Okay.
the judge of that. But yeah.
Yes, I imagine that there is a word that's like anyway.
Yes. Yeah.
It was my job to type up all of these pre-sentence reports, so that the probation officers would dictate them into old tapes. This was in the olden days, 20 years or so ago, before the internet had really taken off, and I would type them up. And so over a period of like 3 or 4 months, I had this insight into all of these people's life stories essentially. And the desk that I was working on, it was mainly just like people who were like stealing stuff out of shops. Really, they would have some sort of addiction and their life had gone wrong and they were just like shoplifting, right? And not always, but most of the time. And in almost invariably in these life histories, I saw this pattern where people would sort of have the usual stuff that life is made of, right? They would have a partner, a home, a job, whatever, kids, some good stuff in their life. And then almost invariably, there was like a bad thing would happen. Some of the stuff that life throws at everybody at some point, right? Like a bereavement, sudden, like, an infidelity, you lose your job, somebody gets really ill, whatever it might be, some really difficult thing to deal with. And then the person would just be completely incapable of dealing with that and would not cope with it well, wouldn't have the strategies, the dispositions, the tools to be able to deal with life's knocks. They would invariably start drinking, taking drugs of one description or another, would get addicted, get into debt, lose their friends, family, end up on the streets stealing stuff from shops. And there are like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people in my hometown alone who fit that exact pattern. And I remember just thinking, like, it's like some of those people were just dealt a really rotten hand, right? They just were like the cards were stacked against them from the outset. But not in every case. But I sort of remember thinking, like, if somebody's born into a really difficult situation, their parents are in prison, or they're addicted to things, or they're not around, or they're neglectful, like that's horrendous, and there's nothing that you can really do about that as a state. But all of those people, or the vast majority of those kids, unless they were homeschooled, right, went through the education system, and we had this like daily window into their lives. And I remember just sort of thinking, like, to what extent do we as educators, does the school system help to prepare people to deal with the vicissitudes of life, you know? And to what extent does it actually make things worse? Does it add to the pile of problems on the in tray? And I quickly ascertained that it was the latter. At least to some extent, it's always a bit of a complicated thing to talk about education, isn't it? Because of course there are loads of amazing things that schools do. They offer a stable platform for people to make friendships and connections and learn about the world and be taught stuff. There's loads of cool stuff in schools, and I don't want to just paint it all as problematic, but it's very clear that we are not preparing people very well for the world of work. And that's not, or rather the world of work, the world beyond the school gates, as it were. And that's not just for those kids who were dealt a difficult hand and who struggle, but you know, the people who are the so-called successes of the education system are often also quite sort of underdeveloped in other areas of their life, let's say. And so it's like we're not really sort of we haven't quite nailed this yet. And yeah, I'll stop talking for now. I could go on for a long time, but yeah, that was sort of my entry into becoming a teacher.
No. I want to come back because I'm fascinated by, you know, the backgrounds and biographies that you got to internalize over your course of a work as the probationary typist. And let's build a bridge to education. Did those ever speak to educational experiences? Were these people who had struggled in school behaviorally? Were they people who had been suspended, expelled, or had negative experiences otherwise? Or was there anything that you would
No,
say characterized that experience for them?
I don't think, like, looking back, I don't remember that there was a particular pattern in terms of their experience of school. As I recall, to the extent that I recall it, as I say, it was a long time ago. It's a really mixed bag. Like some of those kids were like, you know, you get some people who are very able at school, but they've just got other stuff going on, like in their home lives, and they were sort of successful on paper, but they were struggling for whatever reason, and their lives still sort of fell through the cracks, as it were. And so. So essentially, I decided that education was going to be my thing, and I wasn't initially going to be a teacher. I just wanted to study it and to understand it. But then I just thought, you know, to what extent can you really say that you understand something that you haven't been fully immersed in? And so I signed up to be a teacher, and then like 15 years flew by, right? Because the school system just like sucks you in and spits you out the other end. And then
You're on rails and you just go, you know, one holiday, one break, one thing to the next, and 10 years goes by.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Although, so I did get into research. So as you say, you know, you're asking about person-centered education and self-regulated learning. And so right from the outset, I was signed up to do a master's because I wanted to study it alongside teaching it in my second year of teaching. And there was a master's at my local university in what they call person-centered education. And I remember being very influenced at the time by Carl Rogers, right, from whom that language comes, the like person-centered therapy, and this idea that he has, that you may have noticed, I always ask people about on my podcast about this idea of significant learning. Like, what are the episodes that have really shaped you as a person? The learning that counts, really, and very often that stuff doesn't happen in formal educational settings. It's sort of accidental, incidental stuff that happens, just, you know, the randomness of life. Um, and so, yeah, I signed up to do this person-centered masters and got really into philosophical inquiry through doing that, like as a way to have, you know, one pedagogical approach. I don't know if that's particularly widespread in the States, is it? Have you come across this?
An inquiry-based approach. I would say that increasingly it's been, I don't know, demonized, or it's become sort of a four-letter word to speak of inquiry in schools anymore.
Right. Well, so there's, I think there's a slight distinction perhaps between,
Okay.
so there's general like inquiry learning, sort of like
Yes.
like project-based learning, open-ended learning. But then this in particular, I'm speaking about philosophical inquiry, which is like, it was actually developed in the States. Matthew Lipman in the 1970s developed this
Okay.
approach. I think he might have been at Columbia University, perhaps. And he was a philosophy professor who was quite frustrated with the inability of his philosophy undergrads to engage in reasoned discussions. And he was like, you guys need to like we need to start this whole process a lot earlier. And so he wrote a range of children's books, and he developed this pedagogy where you sit in a circle and you have big open-ended conversations about big important ideas. And it's a wonderful thing. It's quite widespread now around the world. It goes by a number of names, but it's mainly called P4C, Philosophy for Children. It's a brilliant way to spend an hour with a group of kids. It's a wonderful thing. Again, it's something that's been quite demonized. The traditionalists hate it because the traditionalists just seem to think that education and learning subject knowledge are synonymous and that there's nothing else to see here. So they don't like it because it's not about teaching subject knowledge, but it is a wonderful thing. It's an incredible way to help kids in all kinds of ways to develop their ability to just speak and listen, to change their mind, to explore ideas, to test their understanding of reality, to learn how to agree with one another and disagree with one another, learn how to disagree with themselves, right? To understand how, paradoxes can be a thing, and we can, the world is not just neatly divided into things that are right and wrong or true or false. So that's an amazing thing. And then that sort of set the path for me to. So actually, what happened there, just to close that bit of the story, I did this philosophical inquiry. I did my dissertation for my master's was all about this approach, and I did these 6 lessons, and I recorded them and typed up everything that was said, and tried to see if there was any changes, anything useful in the data, and there was just nothing. It was just. I was basically trying to run before I could walk, and I hadn't really got the hang of this pedagogy yet. And I was working with a class that I didn't usually teach, so I didn't have that rapport. And basically, there was just nothing good in this data. And I spent 6 months writing this 20,000 word essay about a thing that didn't work, and it just felt grim, And then at the end, and I thought at the end of that summer, I'm done with academic writing, and I'm just going to go back and maybe go into school leadership or something. And then what I found was that the process of thinking so hard and reading all of this fascinating stuff about thinking and reasoning and reading and writing and speaking and learning and what have you, and thinking about what had gone wrong and where I had sort of fallen short, it had just completely transformed me as a teacher. And when I went back into the classroom that September, I was just a different person. Like I just was in my bones. I was a different practitioner. It was like the biggest shot in my arm that I'd ever had in terms of professional learning, which was good in one sense. But then in the other sense, I was like, right, I need the next hit. And so I needed to sign up for a PhD.
Yeah. To what extent did your return to the classroom, having been transformed, sort of make you like a square peg in a round hole? Did you feel angular to the system that you were trying to head back into, or was it a welcome landing place for, new ideas about this philosophical inquiry and self-guided learning?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it was very much the latter, like the school and it was just completely out of happenstance. The school that I was working in was just school in very challenging circumstances, the high levels of disadvantage. The school was in special measures, which is like the naughty step when you get inspected by the school inspectors and it's like you're about to be closed. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so the history of declining results and so on. And we had this new head teacher who had come in and who was just a really forward-thinking guy, a brilliant guy called Stuart McLaughlin. And he brought that person that I mentioned earlier, Kate McAllister, who he had worked with at a previous school. He brought her over to head up this learning. At the time, it was called a Learning to Learn team, a team of 5 teachers who were tasked with teaching the whole of Year 7, which is like age 11, the first year of secondary school. And we had them for 5 lessons a week, so like 20% of curriculum time. And they just the senior team just went like, over to you, like whatever you think these kids need to find their on switch, to become a bit more curious and proactive and engaged, do whatever you think it is. So there was a huge amount of trust placed in us, and away we went. So it was a very much a fertile ground for exploring all of these weird and wacky ideas.
How did that land with the students that you were teaching? Did you find a lot of success with that approach? Did your head teacher approve of the transformation that you brought with you?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Not everything that we did landed. Like we made some mega rookie errors, along the way, of course. But we were given the freedom and the autonomy to do that, right? And there was no judgment there. But very early on, we could see a difference. Just like anecdotally, first of all, people were sort of saying these kids are different. Like they're just more willing to take risks. They're more willing to get involved and to have a go and to sort of to respond to feedback that you give them, which is often, it's not that widespread that happens. And then it started to show up in the data, in their sort of like, we used to keep like attitude to learning scores, and then on the spreadsheets and their progress data. And they would just, so I realized very early on that this was an amazing thing that was happening, and that I wanted to capture it, in the best way that I could. And so I signed up to do a PhD, and that turned out to be an 8-year study, because we followed 4 cohorts of kids from year 7 through to year 11 when they sit their high stakes end of school exams. There was one control cohort, the pre-learning to learn cohort, if you like, and then 3 of these learning to learn cohorts. And the curriculum time, as I say, it started with five lessons in year 7, but then that curriculum time expanded into year 8 and then again into year 9, because we could see that this was going really well, but there was still more work that we wanted to do. And so over 3 years, those kids took part in over 400 lessons. So it was an absolutely massive intervention. And yeah, it had an incredible impact on those kids. They got the best results that that school had ever seen by some margin, massively outstripped that control group, who, it's worth remembering, had 400 more lessons of subject-based learning, right? Because they weren't doing all this stuff. And yet in subsequent measures of subject knowledge, they were being seriously outstripped by this learner effectiveness cohort. And it was especially beneficial for disadvantaged kids. So the gap closed from the bottom up almost completely, which was absolutely, amazing.
Yeah, I'm so curious. I'm just going to keep driving on this because I think it's so fascinating. What is like an example of an intervention that you did in this new group that was different than like what was business as usual for these students that you think, right, was the cause to the effect of the transformation that you saw?
Yeah. So there were a number of them. So we did what you might call, as you can imagine, in 400 lessons, like there's a lot going on, and so we would call it a complex intervention. So like an intervention with many moving parts. So I'd like just to break it down a bit. So one thing was project-based learning, right? And I know that PBL also gets a bad name, right? And it's also on the naughty step, as it were, of education. And I think that I can sort of understand where that's coming from, in the sense of, like, if I was a science teacher originally, and if you're trying to teach science and you do it in an open-ended project-based way, it takes I remember doing like a 6-week project once about chromatography, and the kids finally figured something out that I could have taught them in about a 5-minute demonstration, and you sort of think that's probably not the best use of time. Maybe it was just like, if you're trying to teach science, maybe just teach science. But if you're trying to teach people how to become more effective learners, how to manage their own time and resources, learning what they can and can't do under their own steam, then absolutely project-based learning is the way to go. And so one thing that was really different to what they would have experienced anywhere else would be that so for 3 of those 5 lessons a week, it was project-based stuff. And the very first project was a who am I project, right? So it's like identity, who are you? Over to you. You've got 6 weeks to answer that question, and there's no further scaffolds or anything. Just go. And and it's really interesting at that point. Some of the kids are naturally very organized. Perhaps they have parents who keep to-do lists and they're super organized, and they've seen this model perhaps elsewhere, and they just start ticking off to-do lists, and they organize their time, and they think, right, I'm going to do this for homework in week 3, and they crack on. And other kids, many of them, really flounder, and they just go like, I can't, there's no way that I could begin to organize my thoughts. This is too wide open. And they sort of become this like beached jellyfish. And then there's a really interesting like tension then, because as a teacher, the temptation is to swoop in, to like intervene and throw them a life raft, at the first sign of difficulty.
Yes.
And just like holding that tension. And obviously you don't want them to flounder for 6 weeks and have nothing to show for their time. But you do have to bite your tongue a bit. And essentially what we would find is that you slip into a coaching role rather than an instructional role. And so you sort of sit alongside the kids. And because the other ones are all cracking on with their projects, you have more time in the classroom to do this. And you can just sit alongside a kid and say, what's going on? And just gently try to question them towards sort of their own solutions.
That's so brilliant. and I see so many common threads of folks that I talk to who have switched to, call it a project-based, call it inquiry, whatever label you want to put on it, like this kind of pedagogy, right? An open-ended one where, kids are tasked with organizing themselves, their orientation, the processes that are going to work for them to approach a task. And it's going to be, more or less open-ended and divergent thinking, as opposed to, sort of a closed, what's the most efficient way from point A to point B that we can use to accomplish this learning task. And what you're saying is that the students, as a result of that, felt better and seemed to, at least anecdotally, perform better on those things that we were saying at the beginning of the episode when we were looking at troubled youth or teens who got on the wrong side of the law for whatever reason,
Mm.
seemed to flounder when they hit those times of uncertainty, whether it's because of a lack of resilience or a lack
Right.
of tools in their toolkit for
Yeah.
how do I deal with these difficult situations. What you seem to be saying, what I hear you saying here, is that perhaps your model and vision of the school experience for those kids was one that was more preparing them to deal with uncertainty and open-endedness and to know the tools in their own toolbox that they can wield against the wicked problems that pop up in their life. And school as a really low stakes, safe place with a lot of supportive adults to try new things and fail perhaps, or try new things and succeed and think, what can I do better next time? How do I iterate on these things?
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other big thing, or one of the other big things in this intervention was oracy. Again, I'm not sure if you use that word in the States, but like oracy is
Yep.
this word. You're right. So speaking and listening, spoken language, um, and we did everything with oracy. So like lots of paired talk, group talk, philosophical inquiries, as I said, like formal structured debates. At the end of each half-term project, the kids would have to stand up and do some sort of presentation, like some sort of teachable moment. And they could choose the level of challenge there. That could just be to one person or the teacher after school if they felt really nervous. It could be to the class. It could be to an assembly, to parents, whatever. Sometimes we took them out into primary schools and they would run sessions for other kids. And that was the special sauce, I think, more than anything. Like when you look at what the kids, we would get them to write in their learning journals every week. We would have to ask them to write reflections on how they learn in different subjects, and helping them to facilitate the process of transfer between subjects. And we would often ask them, like, do these lessons help you to learn more effectively in your other subjects, and if so, how? And very strongly in the data it came through, which was like the vast majority said, yes, I do think that this helps me. And then it was confidence. It was just like they would use lots of different language to describe it, but they essentially nearly always said, it's the confidence that I've discovered through learning how to stand up in front of a room full of people and have my voice heard. I feel proud of myself. I have courage. I've found my core identity. This is quite emotional, this work. Sometimes I remember this was actually in a different school, but I was working with an oracy initiative, and I remember this girl. She was about 14, and she was saying that before she had done this speaking and listening qualification, that she felt invisible. That she was just like one of those kids that's just ignored. That they didn't really have friends. They would never be sort of named by other kids. They weren't even disliked. They were just neglected essentially socially. And she said that this project had sort of just helped her to find who she was as a person, and not only she sort of now got friends, and she developed this like really like sort of like black sense of humor that had really that made her very well liked among her peers. But she was from a very big family. She had like 8 or 9 siblings, and she was able to take her place within her family, and she was just bursting with pride. And it's so beautiful to see that. And so I think that like out of all of the things in this complex intervention, it's probably the oracy what done it, as it were.
That's such a great way to put such a powerful statement. It was the oracy what done it. That was it.
Yeah.
What I'm hearing in that transformation, right, is that the business as usual school really seems to focus on content, right? Content is going to be the way that, kids are going to be smarter, they're going to be more able, they're going to be more capable in the world and as human beings and whatever. And that other stuff, that squishy stuff about identity and yourself and your relation to peers, society, family, that'll just come. We don't have to
Yeah.
necessarily worry about that. That'll come. And when it doesn't, then we see the results of that. I think about myself at the beginning of my decade in the classroom and the kind of teacher I was versus the one that I left, and perhaps your own story too, James, like thinking about your, decade plus in the classroom, who you were, and then who you came back as in your transformation. But kind of thinking about teacher training, what could the typical teacher training stand to learn from looking in that direction, from peeking in your transformed classroom, or learning from the world of self-directed education that's currently absent or missing in the UK context?
Yeah. What a great question. I mean, like to pick up on the thread that you just offered there of like this focus on content. and cognition, especially like the rise of cogsci. And I've followed a few of your tweets and posts in recent weeks and months. But there is more to education. I think I wrote this in a blog recently and put each word on a separate line in like bold letters because I was just really trying to emphasize it. There is more to education than cognition. Like there's more to human development than just like memorizing information. And it's one of those funny things where like if you say that to a trad, right, they will go, well, nobody would say that. Nobody would ever argue that is the case. And yet, if you look at virtually all of the discourse around education, virtually all of the blogs and the posts and the talks and the conferences that are going on, it is all about cognition. And so I've recently done this really interesting project with the Welsh government. And there's a huge curriculum reform effort happening in Wales at the moment called Curriculum for Wales. And we've been working on this project around learner effectiveness, which is like another name for learning to learn. It goes by many names, this. We talked about self-regulated learning. Internationally, they often call it like competency-based learning.
Oh, sure.
But it's all the same stuff, really. It's like just the holistic, like the whole child, that sort of thing. And so we've developed this model, which we call the life wheel. And I'm going to try and like paint a picture in your mind and in the minds of your listeners here.
Take us on that ride, James. I'm here for it.
We'll see how it goes. So imagine a circle with 5 wedges in it, right? And then around the outside of that circle, there's a steering wheel, like a ship's wheel with handles sticking out. So the 5 wedges in the middle, right? So we have physical domain, right? So are your learners looking after themselves physically? Do they get enough sleep? Often that's not the case. Do they have a healthy diet? Again, often not really so much. Like you often see kids going into school with like nailing a liter can of like Monster or something, some energy drink on the way into school, not even really being aware of what that does to their blood sugar and what that does to like their neurotransmitters and how that might make them feel a bit cranky at 10:30 in the morning, but they don't really know why. And
it's good to know that Welsh high school students and U.S. high school students exactly the same in that regard. I always used to tell my high schoolers, I was like, "What do you guys need energy for? You're 17 years old. You have as much energy as you're going to have in your entire life. I'd hate to see what's going to happen when you're my age, guys."
Right.
But anyway,
absolutely.
It's just so funny.
But it's just a cheap high, isn't it? Right? Or even they're not even that cheap, those drugs. But it's just like it definitely makes you feel like a bit too alert, let's say. And so we have the physical domain. So the like sleep, diet, also like exercise, of course, but also like understanding your body and how you can use your body as a tool for self-regulation, right? So like, if you're feeling nervous about stuff, wiggling your toes, like pressing your feet into the ground, wiggling your fingers, just bringing your consciousness down into your body is a very, very powerful way to to override your nervous system, to send a message to your nervous system that actually you're safe, you're okay. Because in the present moment, what that exercise does is it brings you into the moment, doesn't it?
Yeah,
and in the present moment,
exercise.
Yeah, exactly. Grounding exercise, breath work is hugely powerful. Lots of different ways of using breath work. And also the physical environment, understanding how the physical environment affects you. We won't go into all of that. So that's wedge number 1, the physical. Next, we have emotional, right? Emotional learning, emotional literacy, talking about your feelings, naming them, understanding the feelings of others, and also developing emotional self-regulation tools and strategies. And the key there is to share a lot of strategies with your students and then allow them to choose and to experiment and to find what works for them. Because you could, for example, as a teacher, let's say, like you're teaching a primary class and they all come in after lunchtime and they're all like bright pink faces, or like they've all, been running around and they obviously, their heart rate is raised, say. And the teacher might go, "Okay, everyone, we're all going to do like a breathing exercise to just get ourselves down, and we're going to just regulate our bodies. And here's a breathing exercise: breathe in for 4, hold for 4, and all of that." And for probably about 2/3 of those kids, that will probably work really nicely.
That'll be fine.
But for some of them, like having your breathing externally regulated, like really just is like makes you feel quite panicky, and that's not for you. And so the key is to rather than doing sort of like we're all going to self-regulate and I'm going to control that, you sort of share all of these resources and then go, right, kids, you've got like, let's say 3 or 4 minutes just to self-regulate. Do what you need to do. Have a stretch, just like shake out your limbs, maybe you need to tidy the resource trays, maybe you want to just put your head down quietly on the table, whatever it is that you need to do to just change your mindset and just get into the zone, and we're going to do some whatever it might be, in a few
Yeah,
minutes.
to help make that transition from
Right.
one, kind of learning and being at school to like another kind, to help
Yeah.
manage that transition and make it smoother for everybody.
Yeah, exactly. Because often, kids come into a lesson, and if something's happened in the playground or in their social circle, somebody just ghosted them right in the corridor, and they're freaking out, and they're like, all they want to do is text their friend and go, "Why didn't you say hello? What's going on?" And they can't do that. But like they walk into the classroom and there's a quiz on the board, and they're expected to sort of talk about all this geography stuff, and their frontal lobes aren't online, right?
When that social thing is all they can see or, to think about. Because the other part of this too is younger kids, they struggle more with, we would call them like executive skills or, regulation. So giving them those tools and giving them the opportunity to practice that is such a
Mm.
awesome transferable skill. And so, yeah, so you're saying the Welsh government is being responsive in this kind of direction to help kids be more self-regulated and I guess emotionally, physically grounded, amongst other things, as a way to perhaps address some of the problems that they're seeing, as opposed to one other response, which might just be like the, crack the cane down and strict
Yeah.
discipline, no talking, zero tolerance.
And this side of the Welsh border, there's no shortage of that. Absolutely. That yeah. So there's plenty of that happening. But yeah, the Welsh government are being really really forward thinking, and so that's I'll go through this quickly. So that's
For
wedge
sure,
two,
for sure.
emotional. Then we have the
Yep.
habitual domain or the behavioral domain, dialing up the habits of effective learners, right? That stuff we were talking about like keeping to-do lists and calendar reminders and workflow. And then on the flip side, like dialing down, if you have problematic behaviors that you habitually engage in, if you are addicted to technology, as so many people are, if you're a chronic procrastinator, as so many people are, like how can you sort of learn how to dial that down a little bit so that you can learn how to allow the procrastinator within yourself to have a bit of airtime. Like you don't want to just crack the whip and zero
Yes.
tolerance yourself into submission, because that doesn't work. And likewise with tech, like how can we help kids to develop the tools? In the wake of Jonathan Haidt's book, lots of schools are saying, well, we're just going to ban smartphones. And that sort of deals with the problem as far as school goes. But if the kids are then exploding onto their smartphones as soon as they get out of school, which many of them are doing, then that's not enough. I don't think. I think that we need to be helping kids to develop those.
Yeah, it just kicks the can down the road a little bit, doesn't it? It
Right.
just says, this is just not something that school is going to deal with. So you
Yeah.
deal with it outside of school. And as we've just been talking about, there are varied responses to what that world outside of school looks like. And not all of those are healthy or sustainable or anything else desirable.
Right. Absolutely. Yes. So that's the habitual domain. Then we have relational learning. And first of all, that's like, how do you relate to yourself? Like lots of people have lots of negative self-talk, right? They beat themselves up. They're the inner critic. They sort of tell themselves little bits of scripts like, oh, you're stupid. You're terrible at maths. That teacher hates you. You're unpopular. You're ugly, whatever it might be. Like lots of people carry around that sort of stuff. And they really believe it. And one of the beautiful things about metacognition is that it just puts the brakes on. It's just a way to just sort of put the brakes on and just to notice that pattern, and then to sort of go, well, what if that's not true? Like that mantra that meditation teachers often say, like, you are not your thoughts. Like often people go through their whole life and they never realize that. You don't have to identify with those thoughts. That's not true. That's not necessarily true. It's just like an unhelpful bit of script that's often coded in early childhood, and you're just sort of telling yourself this story that you come to believe. But when you go through this process of metacognitively reflecting on that, and then you can say, oh, okay, what if that's not true? Like, what if there's another story that I could tell myself? What if that story was true up until today, but from this day forth, maybe a different story could be true, and maybe I could step into that reality, and maybe I could start to enjoy aspects of math, or maybe I could start to love myself or be kinder to myself, and all of that stuff is possible. And so relating to self is a big one. Also relating to others, of course, in relational learning, and relating to the wider world. So that's the relational wedge. Then we have the fifth one, which is cognitive. So this is not some sort of anti-cognition, memory thing. So, learning cognitive strategies, understanding about how brains learn things, how memories are formed and what have you, and what works for you. And then developing strategies. And then around the outside is this the ship's wheel bit. We call it the life wheel. Is the navigational domain, right? Which is like sort
Okay.
of thinking about where are you now in relation to any of this stuff: sleep, diet, exercise. Have you got a really chaotic social life and there's always drama everywhere and you keep generating it and you don't know how to make it stop? Whatever it might be, and where do you want to be, and how might you get from A to B? And then there's these sort of change tools. And so we've developed this with Kate and this steering group of 17 schools around Wales. We've created this toolkit. There's like 72 strategies, so there's like 12 in each of these 6 domains that are designed to help kids to figure out what's going on for them and how they can move forward in all of these areas of their life. And so it's not, like I say, it's not anti-cognition at all. But what I often see in schools is that, like, if you picture that ship's wheel as like a roulette wheel, it feels like schools have just put all their chips in the cognitive wedge, and it's all that you hear people talking about. And I see this so often in the schools that I work in, where like the teachers are doing a really good job in that cognitive wedge. They're planning really good lessons. There's good resources. There's revision strategies. They've got all the equipment and flashcards and all of that. But the information is not sticking, and it's not because of any cognitive deficit. It's because there are unaddressed issues in these other areas of their lives that are just not getting the attention that they need.
Yeah, it's putting the cognitive, I mean, it's situating it inside the whole learning context. I mean,
Right.
students aren't able just to take their brain out and put it on the desk and say, okay, just teach this part of my brain today, separate from all of the other, separate from my body, which is separate from the space, which is separated
Right.
from the social context and the behavior,
Yeah,
relational,
and separate
etc.
from my feelings, my
Yeah,
inconvenient
exactly.
feelings.
Yeah. Unfortunately, as a human being, I have to deal with all of these things all the time, all at once. I can't do that. Wouldn't it be great if students could be severed, like in the show Severance, where
Right.
when they walk into school,
Oh,
suddenly
oh
they
man.
forget
There are some
this.
traditionalists working on a severance chip. I assure you that's happening.
I won't give Greg Ashman any ideas, but 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 that is truly their vision of it. And I think this is just so much more of an honest approach to say, right, like we don't have the luxury of just teaching cognitive beings, right? We teach kids, embodied humans in all of the messy context, and we have to grapple with those in schools, whether we like it or not. Because if we don't, and we don't give kids the tools to either self-regulate or co-regulate, right, with people who have more capability in that area, so that way they can one day self-regulate, then we're just kicking the can, be it with phones, which explode outside of school, or with other behaviors too, where kids who are nominally successful in the cognitive parts of school hit a wall and
Hmm.
have neglected the what we've called soft skills or any of these other executive skills, and
Right.
now they don't know how to function and fall into bad habits and behaviors. So it really
Right.
just seems like so much more of an honest, holistic human approach to things. How has the Welsh government, how have they navigated the pressure from test scores or from, being put in the league tables on international assessments? Or do they just say, like, do they have the courage to say, we don't care about all that. We care about our kids and we want to do what's best for them, regardless of what the league tables say?
Right. I mean, of course, there's a bit of both there, right? Like, and there like with any sort of national reform efforts, like there is an understandable degree of anxiety around
Yeah.
what is this going to do? Is this going to negatively impact like literacy, numeracy? There are lots of issues that are just common across the world, but that are very live in Wales around like absenteeism, lots of sort of disengagement, lots of like quite challenging behaviour in schools, and so on. And of course, they're concerned to improve literacy and numeracy and exam scores as well. It's just about finding the balance, right? And I think that like a completely self-directed environment, and I've worked in places like that are just like yes, like the self-managed learning college in Brighton, which was just it is literally self-managed like the whole way through. And I kind of feel like that's just a bit too loose, right? And I'm very comfortable with the idea of just finding this middle ground of having subject learning and self-directed learning. I think my ideal model would be something like 60% of the time would be spent in subject learning, 20% in self-directed learning, a bit like what we had, five lessons a week, and then 20% interdisciplinary learning, right? Because that's the other thing that just so often, well, it just doesn't get addressed, does it? Like the world is not divided into, if you turn the news on at night and they go, in geography news, we've discovered a new volcano, and in history news, like that's not the world, is it? The world, like you say, just like people are all a mess of interconnected stuff, so is the world. And this sort of very atomized model of understanding the world that's presented by a purely subject-based curriculum is wild. And so I would go 20% interdisciplinary learning as well, so that we can start to figure out how all of this stuff fits together.
And probably overlapping Venn diagrams between all of those things, right? Your interdisciplinary is going to touch the disciplinary. You're going to,
of course, yeah.
You're going to dip in and out of, deep subject matter and then come back up to make the interdisciplinary connections. And then there might be a self-guided inquiry in and amongst all of those too, and then a collaborative piece. So, it's just, I think it's such a refreshing approach, and an honest approach too, I think, to really the multiple and varied goals of schools, which have to be more than, just filling your brain with as much content as possible. I found, quick side note, but I found the piece that you were talking about where you wrote, there is more to human development than learning of subject knowledge. And you have this great cartoon on here that shows kids with like barcodes, or I don't know if it's barcodes or if they have like USB drives.
It's USB ports.
It's USB. Okay. It says, just upload the curriculum into their long-term memory and call it a day. If only it were so easy, right?
Right.
If only that was the task before us, but it is not.
Yeah, but I've like people, there are people who genuinely do think that is your job as a teacher, and that if you that people like you and I and other people who are interested in this broader agenda are guilty of overreach, right? And that this is like the domain of parents, and that we should just like resign ourselves to just teaching geography in the most efficient way possible, or whatever subject it might be, and then leave all of that messy stuff beyond the school. And we need that. We need people who are subject specialists. Like one of my educational heroes is a guy called Ian Cunningham, the guy who set up the Self-Managed Learning College in Brighton, where I worked for a while. And he talks about P mode and S mode learning. And he sort of says you need both. And for him, like P mode is like, who is the person? What are the problems that they face? What are their patterns, their proclivities, right? You could come up with a bunch of P's, but it's essentially person-centered stuff. And then S mode learning is like subjects and skills and specialisms and so on, stuff that you need to know. And what he says is that you need to start with P and then go to S. So like figure out who is the person, what is it that they want to achieve in life, what are their goals, and then we'll figure out what's the S stuff that's going to help them become the P that they want to be. And schools just start with S and stay there, right? And it's like we don't really care who you are as people, or what your passions are, or proclivities or problems. It's just like you just got to do this stuff, right? And we've got it all worked out for you, and that's why we see so much of this disengagement, right? And what's just so interesting is that like in some ways, as teachers are sort of getting better at their jobs in many ways, at being more sort of efficient at subject teaching and at testing and at using formative assessment and becoming much more research engaged as a profession, and engaging with aspects of cognitive science and what have you. In some ways, the profession feels sort of more professional and a bit more sure-footed than it has been in the past, certainly in my early years as a teacher. And yet at the same time, if you look at what's going on beyond the test scores, the attendance crisis is absolutely bewildering. The mental health crisis is bewildering. There's teacher retention and recruitment issues aplenty. There's so many, like lots of challenging behavior. There's so many issues, the so-called Polycrisis, right, that I wrote about recently. And so we've got this very sort of like bifurcated image where on the one hand, schools are sort of becoming more efficient, and yet it seems to be having a sort of like, I don't know whether I would hesitate to put a causal relationship on this. I think that these two things are sort of happening in tandem rather than one necessarily being caused purely by the other, although you could probably draw a few lines across. But yeah, like the picture is not pretty, right? Like kids are really struggling to attend. They're not feeling good about themselves. and all of this very efficient teaching and learning doesn't really seem to be helping very much.
Yeah. So earlier this year, James, you published a piece on your Substack titled Confronting the Educational Crisis, Polycrisis, forgive me, 7 Crises, One System, and a Path Forward. We've been kind of skirting around the edges of it. I quoted it in the introduction, and it seems like in an age of marketing and easy answers, that piece, like the rest of this conversation so far, has been the most honest that I've seen about the scope and scale of the problems facing schooling and society, as well as, the complexity and urgency of those solutions.
Yeah.
I think for listeners, despite having a localized UK context for you, I found those issues and the potential solutions universal across what we might consider Western school systems. And
Mm.
there were echoes to me of what Posse Solberg dubbed GERM, or the global education reform movement, and this ensuing malaise, that seems to be more than just a lingering side effect of the pandemic. Something seems to have been transformed. And I'll bring up an example for listeners if they're not super familiar. But in a recent episode of your own podcast, you highlighted UK trends in international math and science data, or the TIMSS data, that reported secondary pupils in England have amongst the lowest school engagement rates in the world, which just shocked me. And the difference was so stark between past performances, stark differences between girls and boys. At the same time, as you were mentioning, growing absenteeism, behavior and disciplinary crises, girls feeling far less safe at school compared to boys, less safe than girls in peer countries. There's just so much to unpack in that polycrisis. How would you describe the current state of schooling in the UK, and what are those challenges shaping the polycrisis?
Yeah. It's a heavy topic, this one. And it's this term polycrisis is generally used like just more broadly to describe the sort of like nexus of like interlocking issues like around global conflicts, energy crises, the climate crisis, and economic fluctuations and what have you. And it's often referred to as the polycrisis. And in that piece, I sort of tried to argue the case that we have an educational polycrisis. If we just zoom into education, this is one part of the polycrisis, as it were. But within education, there are all of these. There's this like multiple pile up, and like you were describing. And so, yeah. So in that piece, I mentioned 7, but I could have easily gone into high into the double figures. For example, I didn't mention the special educational needs and disabilities crisis, which is very acute in this country. So looking at attendance, behavior, teacher retention and recruitment, almost any metric, mental health and well-being is in terrible shape, not just among children and young people, but among educators as well. The mental health of educators is not in good shape. And it's one of those interesting, like, so the word crisis is used in different ways, isn't it? Like sometimes people sort of like something like a humanitarian crisis, or there's something that's sudden, there's been an earthquake or something, and there's just like sudden bad situation that needs to be dealt with. And then there's more of like a creeping crisis, something that's sort of just gradually getting worse, a little bit like the attendance figures, for example. Like there were more and more and more kids not attending school, and that was the trend was increasing quite steeply before COVID. It was hugely exacerbated by COVID, but it's still continuing to increase post COVID. And these things eventually get to the point where you might say, well, we are at crisis point now. Like this is, at the moment now we're over 20%. Over 20% of the kids in this country are persistent absentees from school, and there's only 9 million kids. So that over 2 million students are persistent absentees. Of those, about 150,000 are missing more than half of their time at school. There's on top of that, there's about another 150,000 kids who are homeschooling, and the numbers of those are increasing all the time, as they are in the States as well. And within that, there's lots and lots of suffering, and it's not like we're not having this conversation in a vacuum. It's not just some sort of ideological discussion on an intellectual level about like the merits of inquiry learning versus direct instruction. It's like there are lots and lots of people who are really suffering because of the way that the system is currently configured. And I think that I'm not really like a conspiracy theorist about that. I just think that like the road to hell is paved with good intentions. and at every turn, people have sort of tried to do things that they think are in the children's best interests. Like, for example, setting up Ofsted. We have this like school inspectorate called Ofsted, and the aim there was that there were some schools that were so unruly, and that we needed to get a window into those schools, and the harsh gaze of this school inspectorate would persuade those schools to jolly well pull their socks up and get their game in order and improve outcomes for kids. And in some ways, that is what happened when we introduced Ofsted. But also, Ofsted became this very, very toxic influence of just this like high stakes, high pressure accountability. And recently, there was this huge, very tragic situation in this country where a school was judged to be inadequate by a team of school inspectors, and the head teacher took their own life as a consequence of this. And there was this huge sort of backlash against that. And so it's just one example, or like introducing standardized exams, setting high expectations in terms of literacy and numeracy, having a pass-fail rate so that so that it means something. But of course, that then means that you have enforced failure. And so like at every step along the way, we've sort of like individuals have tried to tinker with the system, and we've ended up with this set of policies and practices that together are proving to be really quite problematic in all kinds of ways, and they're showing up in as you say, in all of these different crises, which are very sort of interconnected. But therefore, I think the hopeful spin on all of this is that because these crises are all interconnected, if we can figure out where the end of the piece of string is, and I have one or two suggestions, we're going to really alleviate lots of those problems simultaneously, because they sort of have knock-on effects,
I get the sense in the United States that it's not necessarily, as you were saying earlier, cause and effect, but I get the sense that a contributing factor to the crises of both K-12 and of higher education in the United States is just the high stakes that we've put on education as a
Yeah.
whole to solve all of the problems of society in lieu of other social, political, structures and supports. So, in the United States, we just say, hey, education is the pathway to a good job. And a good job will get you health care, and it will get you housing, and it will get you these things. And if you don't have those in the United States, right, you're destitute, So education is incredibly high stakes. And the results of a lack of success within that system can be incredibly punishing.
Yeah.
And I don't know if maybe in the UK you've seen a shift to that too, in the sense of cuts to healthcare, more austerity measures, less social spending and things. I kind of see these as interrelated factors. Do you get that
Yeah.
sense as well?
100%, yes, absolutely, and again, that's partly some of the reason for all of the stress that's felt by teachers. I think is that there's been so much discussion around disadvantage, as though it's like teachers' jobs to fix the disadvantage gap, and actually, the disadvantage gap is economic, and like the answer to that is to give money to poor people, and that's going to like close that disadvantage gap. But we haven't quite taken to like, put two and two together there. And so absolutely, yeah, there's austerity that was happening throughout the 2010s, and rather grimly, even though we've recently just had a change of government to a government that on paper looks more progressive, there's still like a 2-child cap on child benefits. They're taking the winter fuel allowance away from pensioners. They're reducing disability allowance. It's grim, right? And absolutely. And so these wider societal pressures, the economic reality of a very divided and unequal and polarized external world is like an unhelpful backdrop for sure.
Yeah, and trying to use school-based solutions as school-based policies as solutions to structural, social, economic inequalities that existed before kids got through the schoolhouse door, and that they'll go back to, when they leave school.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's sort of all downstream from those things in my mind.
Yes, yeah, I think so. We yeah. You were saying about how that in the UK we have this like terrible data around like the kids are they I think that the Tim's data that you mentioned, it was something like, do you enjoy school? I think that was the question, and it was like far fewer
Yep.
kids are answering yes to that than at any point in history. And that's also happening against a backdrop, as you say, of it's just actually just to to link to something else that you mentioned earlier about the sort of like the manosphere, right? And like recently there was this program, I don't know if you caught it, it was on Netflix called Adolescence. And it was very much a UK based program, but it was about this young boy who sort of gets involved in this crime, and he was influenced by these online sort of manosphere type people, and it was all about misogyny and incels and all of that stuff. Um, and there was sort of this moral panic about it. There was a bit like a public outcry, and people were like, "Oh my goodness, there's this new sort of like terrible thing happening in schools." And you know, like things like this flare up from time to time. You know, like issues around smartphone use, issues around whatever, like the Me Too movement, and you know, like sexual equality and gender issues and what have you. And there just needs to be some time and space in the school day for us to just talk about this stuff. And like another piece that I wrote recently was making the case for making sense lessons, just like one lesson a week, to just sit like in one of those inquiry circles like we were talking about earlier, and just so that who's got something to bring. You can have a little suggestion box. What do you want to ask questions about? You might not want to say it publicly, but what do you want to ask a question about? And let's just talk about this. Let's talk about the manosphere. Let's talk about misogyny or whatever, and just let's sort of make sense of this very rapidly changing world that we're all sort of plugged into, and everyone's a bit on the back foot. You know, AI is just rampantly eating away at almost every aspect of our lives, and every time you open your computer, there's a new AI there trying to do something for you. And we all sort of need time to to just like have a conversation about this and say like, you know, is everyone okay with this? Like what is everyone okay? Like what's
Yeah,
happening
it could
here?
just be the "is it everyone okay" circle, and we'll just go around
Right.
and just be like, "Hey,
Yeah.
are we all doing okay? Are
There
there
you
things
go.
that we want to talk about here, whatever?" And again, that doesn't have to be an 8 hour a day, 5 days a week program. That takes 5-10 minutes. You know,
Yeah.
maybe it's a mini lesson that emerges out of that, but at least you're being responsive to students in that moment. This
Yeah.
conversation brought to mind a conversation we had with a real small staff of teachers in North Carolina a while ago. And, you know, when we were talking about students and their needs, sort of the typical teachers lounge criticisms of kids came up where, you know, they don't know how to write emails, they don't know how to change a tire, they can't, you know, they don't have all of these things. And we just sort of redirected the conversation to say, like, hey, if we think that these are important things, don't we think that's worth taking time out of the day to teach for kids? And
Mm.
again, not 8 hours a day, but if you want kids to know how to write an email to an adult, you know, who it might be a little bit more of a formal relationship instead of just talking like you're texting your friends, we'll just teach a 15-minute lesson about that, right? Like, and maybe, hey, once a week for, I don't know, half an hour, you can just make a list of all those things, either that you think kids should be able to know and do, or go to kids themselves and ask, hey, what's a question that you guys have about,
Mm.
you know, the world that scares you? What do you want to know how to do? And us as supportive adults in the community, we'll take the time out of the week and help you, you know, be more confident and capable with those things, right? Pull up, you know, the principal's car outside and let's all take turns, you know, jacking it up here and swapping the tire out. Let's take half an hour just to learn how to do that. How do you, you know, how do you deal with all these different things that pop up in the course of your life? And if we
Yeah.
think as adults that they're important, let's take time out of the school day to deal with it instead of, you know, just say like the path to success is
Yeah.
through memorizing content knowledge. I
Right.
think maybe I've stumbled onto something here in my head as I've been talking my way through this, but perhaps is it the case that kids feel an alienation from the world and they can sense the artifice of school, you know, in the sense that school is not addressing things that I find are important, and it's not the venue for me to find purpose and meaning. So I
Right.
find that elsewhere. Could that be a
Yeah.
little bit of the disengagement just in terms of
100%.
alienation and isolation from school itself?
I really think so. I mean, we're just telling this very outdated and really quite dry story, which is like if you attend school every day, which is hard, and you probably don't want to do that, and we'll, by the way, we'll fine your parents if you don't attend, and if you know study really hard for all these exams, which has got stuffed full of all this like arcane dry knowledge. And by the way, there's too many of them. Like you only need 5 exams to get into college, but we're going to make you do 10 subjects. And actually across a month, like our kids at age 16, they do 27 exams in the space of a month. It's just absolutely inhumane.
And
um
those exams essentially, you know, mark a trajectory for the rest of your adult life, basically in the GCSEs.
Yeah, absolutely. And then if you pass those exams and you do really well, then you can go on to university and get into £100,000 worth of debt, and then you'll be
Yep.
happy, right? That's literally the story that we're saying, and none of the teachers even believe that. Like I think that when university tuition fees were free, and I was in one of the last cohorts to go through with that. Um, it was an appealing story. Yeah, fuck it, go to university. Sorry, I don't know if we're allowed to swear on your podcast. Go to uni and just
Yeah.
study something, but just for the love of it. But now that's a very different equation, and of course, those kids have been told this irrelevant story by people who are purveying this like quite difficult, abstract, often really just quite arcane, like I say, knowledge about the periodic table and the nitrogen cycle and the magnets and things that you could very well find very interesting if you did that P mode to S mode thing, but just
Was
starting with
just
S
thinking
mode,
that,
just out of the
yes.
clear blue sky. Here's the specific heat capacity of steel, kids, and they're all like, whoa. Like almost the only rational response to that is to reject it. And as you say, they explode onto their smartphone, and there's like Andrew Tate smoking a cigar in a sports car surrounded by whatever semi-naked people, and then they're like, here's another version of what masculinity is, or what a successful life is, or how to make money on OnlyFans or whatever, and you can live this materialistic life. And naturally, kids are finding that an appealing story, and so
which one's more appealing to a 13-year-old, right?
right,
Yeah.
absolutely. And
We need to
so we need to figure out like a way to tell better stories. And like you said, the thing that you've got on your t-shirt, trust students, man. Like that's all it takes, is just to give them, and I think maybe even more than trust, just like respect students, just like literally just like listen to them, let their views and concerns and anxieties and hopes be heard and seen and taken seriously, and help them to sort of to take their own steps on that journey. And that's going back to that life wheel thing. The aim of that is that the kid stands at the helm, as it were. The kid is standing at that ship's wheel, figuring out where they want to steer their ship from one week to the next. And like I say, I'm not saying that we should get or do away with subject learning and only do this stuff. I reckon about 20% of the curriculum time would be a good balance.
And I think over the course of the conversation, we've charted some models and examples of schools and contexts and classrooms like your own that have seen turnarounds in students and schools as a
Yeah.
result of just not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but just shifting the balance a little bit, right? Being that much more responsive, providing that much space, incorporating different frameworks. And I think as I think about, the United States and its polycrisis as the one in the UK and its relationships, and then the need for poly solutions to the polycrisis, what needs to change? You have sort of a 95 theses on this piece, James, about what needs to change. What needs to change, and how do we get there, man?
So that feels like the sort of question that I should say, like,
And go.
yeah, that feels like the sort of question that I should say, well, I couldn't possibly date it, but I literally do think that I have like a really good workable solution
You
to this.
do, yeah.
And it comes in two layers, right? So one of them is like what we do in terms of like what we're doing with the kids, and one of them is about how we run schools. So in terms of the kids, like we've already touched upon it a few times, but just carve out some time in the space in the school week, as much as you can muster, up to like that maximum model that I talked about. So the minimum offer, I would say, 2 lessons a week. Number one of those making sense lessons, which I think would act as almost as like a release valve. It's just like, oh, you don't have to write anything in this lesson. The teachers don't have to plan anything. They just have to sit there and just check in with each other and make sense of stuff and speak and listen together. And that's a wonderful thing to do. And also a weekly review lesson. So like this work that I've been doing with Welsh Government. So we're advocating, not every school will do this. These things can fit into school days in all kinds of different ways. But the idea is that you have one lesson a week where you sort of spend 20 minutes looking back at the previous week. So it might have been the previous week, you might have set yourself a goal, and it was like develop a sleep routine. So like a winding down routine, set yourself a bedtime alarm, turn your screens off, read a book, have a bath, whatever it is, just like figure out how to make sure that you're getting enough sleep. And so that was your target last week. And so let's just review that. How did it go? How is your sleep looking? Maybe you've got some data on an app on your phone or whatever, right? And then so you reflect on that and you all talk together. And then the middle bit of the filling of the sandwich, if you like, is like, here's a new strategy that we might try this week. And this is breath work, or it's about, whatever it might be. There's 72 of these strategies that we've come up with. And then there's the final bit of the lesson is planning, right? So like, when are we going to do this? What does it look like? Let's practice some of these breathwork techniques so that we've got the hang of it, and think about when in the next few days do you think might be a good time to do that? When do you think that you might, if you're about to go and play a sports match or something, maybe you want to do it before then, whatever it is, so you can sort of plan it. And then again, you review that the following week. And it's just, and that's sort of very simple, just like checking in and taking action. It's like monitoring and control. That's what metacognition and self-regulation boils down to. It's just like checking in, taking action, notice patterns in your thoughts, your feelings, your behaviors, try stuff, do stuff, feedback on it, and just talk about it, And so that would be my minimum offer. Like, if you have a weekly making sense lesson and a weekly to-do lesson, something like lasting on a Friday, first thing on a Monday, something like that to bookend the week would be lovely. If you wanted to dial that up a little bit, I would go 20% self-directed learning, a bit like the model that we developed at Seaview. And there's quite a few people who advocate for this. There's a guy in this country called Derry Hannum who's been campaigning for years on 20% of curriculum time. And if people are interested in that, I hesitate to do the book plug thing, but I wrote a book a few years ago called Fear is the Mind Killer, with my amazing colleague who I've mentioned about 5 times already, Kate McAllister. And that's like a working sort of handbook for like how to do that 20% thing. It's got all the information that you need is in there. And then if you really wanted to dial it up, I would do that 20% interdisciplinary learning thing. So I think, just carve out time and space in the school day for kids to take more ownership over their learning. And then on the leadership side, I wrote another book that came out earlier this year called Making Change Stick. And it's about like drawing lessons from implementation science and improvement science and applying them to education. And at the heart of this model is this idea of a slice team. So you have, instead of decisions all being made by senior leaders, which is what nearly always happens, the top brass, the leadership, the myth of the heroic leader that we labor under, not just in education, right, but in health, in business, in politics. We all just seem to accept that there is just supposed to be a small number of people at the top of these pyramids who can sort of save us from ourselves. And it doesn't work very well, does it? If you look at all of these like very deep-rooted problems that are happening around the world, it's very clear that our political leaders do not have the answers to those problems. And likewise, senior leaders, and part of the reason is groupthink, which is just like those people are all quite like-minded. School leaders are all school leaders. They are not classroom assistants. They are not early career teachers. They are not kids with special needs. And so the idea of a slice team is you get a representative group of people, all those different types of people, all around the decision-making table together, not just as a consultation exercise, but literally like that slice team becomes the executive that's tasked with overseeing this particular area of school improvement. And it's amazingly effective. I've been doing this, again, lots in Wales, but also around the world. And 2 things happen when you work with a slice team in this way. One is that you get much better decision making because you're looking at these problems from all these multiple lenses, multiple perspectives. And 2, you get buy-in. Like, people come with you on the journey because they can see that this isn't just more like being told what to do by somebody in a suit, but they feel represented and respected and listened to, and they come with you on the journey. And I think that's a big part of the solution as well.
Yeah, just as I would imagine there's a shift in the classroom, there has to be that shift in leadership towards a more balanced approach. And for me, it just sort of makes sense, I think, because one person can only ever have one set of maybe changing ideas, or they're getting orders from somebody else if they're a government officer or something like that. But I would imagine a larger group of people, if you take that slice or that like ice core sort of idea, right? If you drill down, pull that out here and count the slices, you're going to inevitably end up with more and better ideas from the people about which those policies and changes are going to impact. So not only are they going to be better ideas, but they're going to be more sustainable, and you're going to get buy-in anyway. So that just makes so much sense as a starting point for leadership anyway. Is there a third layer to this? There's like a school-based one. There's a school leadership one. Is there like a third leg of the stool here, or what do we got? Oh no, James, I don't know if that was
sorry,
me.
I beg your pardon. No, I muted myself.
Okay, no.
I'm back. Yeah, so funnily enough, I've just spent most of the last week writing a green paper, like an uninvited green paper, an independent green paper. Do you know if your green papers in the States? It's sort of like it's usually a government paper. So you have a green paper, which is like a discussion paper, and then a white paper, which sort of sets out what this legislation is likely to do, and then you have legislation, right? And so a green paper is essentially a discussion paper, but I've just written a green paper, which I'm going to approach some friends in politics with and say, like, we should have slice politics, right? Ooh. That's what we should have. Like, instead of just having like a small number of people at the top of like the Department for Health or the Department for whatever it might be. You've got some interesting picks for departments in your country at the moment. Not all of them with much domain expertise, let's say.
Shameful.
And so, but if you had a slice team, right? So if you think about the Department for Education, which is the most natural one to think about, instead of just having one person at the top of that organization, and if you go to the Department for Education, I imagine they still have this. They did a few years ago. They have one of those like pictures of everybody on the wall, and the Secretary of State is at the top, and then they've got their senior leadership team in a row beneath them, and it's just that pyramid again. And it's ridiculous to think that one person has got all the answers. But instead, we should have a slice team at the top of that organization with a horizontal slice, first of all. So you have like somebody who's an expert in special educational needs, in early years, in assessment, curriculum, whatever it might be. There's probably about 20 different areas of education. And then each of those people would be supported by a vertical slice team. So in special educational needs, there would be a SENCO, the Special Educational Needs Coordinator from a school or two, primary and secondary. Young people who have experienced what it's like to live life with these special educational needs and neurodivergencies and what have you. Parents, classroom teachers, middle leaders, senior leaders, researchers, policymakers, all working on SEND policy, right? And then you'd also have a slice team looking at attendance and behavior. You'd also have a slice team, and so and then each of them would be connected geographically through further horizontal teams. So you have this network of slices where you just have much more representative decision making, essentially. And I think that is also like, if you were to say like, what's the third leg of the stool? Let's change what's happening at the classroom level. Let's change what's happening at the level of school leadership. And yeah, we need to shoot the big fish in this tank here and say, like, we need to really, really rethink the way that we go about politics. And I think maybe this is a bit off the charts for your podcast, but just very briefly, if I may, like, it really feels like this is an idea that for which the time is ripe, where we've got this very like super polarized world, ever further polarizing. The algorithms are just dividing people day by day, to the extent that we have just wildly different. I listened to a really good podcast about US politics recently, and they were talking about, it's like the same people are watching the same news stories, but they're just watching two different movies. There's just two completely different narratives are playing out, looking at the same stuff and interpreting it in wildly different ways. And I think the only way that we're going to navigate this very complex, rapidly changing, divided world is by putting diverse groups of people together in rooms and just talking it out, right? And this just feels to me like this idea of slice politics is the operating system that we need. And it's also, in some sense, it's like a pure form of populism, right? It's like it's the ultimate anti-elite, like anti-incumbency argument. It's just like, we need to not just have like these career politicians making decisions. Let's have people like you in the corridors of power shaping the decisions that affect people like you. It feels like that's an idea whose time has come, but so far there's only me who thinks that. So I'm working on that.
Banging that gone. Although, you know what I have to say, as someone who's been like inundating himself with Dewey and reading, back 100 years through Dewey's works,
Uh-huh.
sounds a lot like the kind of participatory democratic classroom models that, in the
Yes.
Deweyan sense, which is an American ideal at its heart, right?
Right.
Is a participatory democratic education as a bulwark against, autocracy and oligarchy and, anti-democratic, illiberal ends in society. And I think, Dewey would argue that that dialogue between classroom and the world outside of the classroom, right? They influence each other, just like you said at the inkling that you had at the beginning of this episode, right? And I think the more that we've lost schools as the kinds of places like you're talking about here, when I was listening to your solutions, James, it sounds like you have one solution for all three of those places, and it's more democratic decision making, right? More responsiveness, not less. It's break down, hierarchies both within the classrooms between teachers and students, right? And those dichotomies and contentions between novice and expert and teacher and learner. And
Yeah.
then within schools between teachers and head teachers and school administrators and officials, and then outside of the classroom as well in government and politics to say oh, I'm the administrator for this program, or I'm this officer, I'm that, but really just flattening those and getting a wider range of participation from a number of voices seems
Right.
to being responsive to a wider range of voices seems to resolve all three legs of that stool. It seems almost too easy, honestly.
I'm glad to have your vote. It's and it's not that radical an idea. We're not
It's
saying
not.
we're not saying smash the hierarchies. We're just saying let's just get people from different layers of the hierarchy to just be in communication and see if we can work in harmony towards common goals. And people at different layers of the hierarchy are very willing and able to take part in that conversation. I'm delighted to report.
James, if people wanted to continue this conversation after hitting stop on the podcast app, how can they connect with you? How can they read the work? How can they go through the various articles that you've been talking about in the course of this conversation?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm quite easy to find. I have a fairly unusual name, so just Google me, and I suppose my Substack, like most people, I'm gravitating towards Substack, which for now feels like the civilized social media platform that the world has been waiting for. But who knows? It probably won't be too long before it becomes. Goodness knows what happened to X. Oh goodness! If anything, it seems like it's been number one. I'm really glad to Musk for just breaking my addiction to that website. He just snapped it overnight, and so many other people. And it's also been a sinkhole for all of those people who want to just explore the worst facets of human nature. They're all over there now, and this civilized discussions happening in Substack. So yeah, look me up on Substack. I do 2 Substacks. One of them is called Rethinking Education, and the other one is called Making Change Stick, and that's more about school leadership and the slice team stuff. There's way more to it than just the slice teams. And yeah, drop me a line if you would like. And I'm involved in all kinds of other things. Actually, I'll just do a quick name drop for a couple. One of them is if you're in the UK and you're listening to this, there's a thing called the Education Policy Alliance, which, as you would probably guess by now, is a slice of different types of people: kids, parents, educators, academics, classroom teachers, all working together on policy solutions. And we're holding an event in Manchester later this year, in the north of England, not the US, Manchester. So come along to that and get in touch with that's educationpa.org. And in the States, so it's more of a global thing, really. But off the back of that Making Change Stick book, there's a guy in Canada called Richard Fransham, who's an alternative educator, very interested in democratic education and rights-based education. And we've recently set up a group of people who are dotted all over the world, but quite a lot of them based in the US. There's a guy called Don Berg, who you might have come across, who wrote a book.
I know Don Berg.
You know
it's so
Don.
wild.
Oh,
you
okay.
mentioned him in that episode with Warwick and with Naomi, and I was like, hold on. I had to pause it at the gym. I was like, is he talking about Don Berg that I know, Don Berg? Yeah, in his book, the Agentic Schools Manifesto and everything.
Yeah, which is brilliant. So Don's involved in this, and there's also these other people who are great. who are from an organization called World Systems Solutions, WSS.
Okay.
If you look up, I think that might be wssnow.org. And they're really interesting. I had some fantastic conversations with them. And they are essentially about like what we're talking about doing to fix education. They're sort of making the very interesting point, like, what if we manage to turn education around and we create these agentic self-directed learners who then go out into the world and just hit all of these brick walls because there's all this other stuff, there's all these other problems. And so they're talking about this very complex model that they have called the Phoenix platform, which is about figuring out how we can create synergy between all of these different systems at different layers of society, so that we can bring like-minded people together to figure out some of the world's most pressing problems. They're really interesting. And so there's this new sort of think tank, if you like, that's emerged. I'll send you a link if you want to stick it in the show notes.
Yes, of course.
And it's called RCE, Making Change Stick. And the RCE stands for Rights-Centric Education. And so we have these weekly conversations on a Tuesday. I think there's actually one in just a few hours from now. Feel free to join that and get involved in that conversation, because there's some really interesting people all over the world who are putting our heads together and figuring out what we can do to chip away at this polycrisis situation that we find ourselves in the middle of.
Yeah, this looks incredible. I'm definitely gonna have to follow up on this. James, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Nick. It's been an absolute delight, and thank you so much for the invitation. We'll have to return the favor. I'll get you on the Rethinking Ed podcast sometime soon.
Thank you again for listening to our podcast at Human Restoration Project. I hope this conversation leaves you inspired and ready to start making change. If you enjoyed listening, please consider leaving us a review on your favorite podcast player. Plus, find a whole host of free resources, writings, and other podcasts all for free on our website, humanrestorationproject.org. Thank you.